And I know you once said that even though the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, it wasn't until really the civil rights movements where those were really put to the test. Because I think you said before, you actually have to fight for that and constantly fight for that freedom, because it's not just a given.
The First Amendment doesn't protect freedom of speech. The First Amendment, if you read it, protects prior restraint, but you can be punished for the speech under the First Amendment. First Amendment doesn't say anything about that. Actually, it wasn't until the 20th century that the issue started reaching the High Court, the Supreme Court. If you look at the early statements mildly supporting freedom of speech, they were actually dissents by Holmes and Brandeis, and very weak ones. Really wasn't until basically the civil rights movement that a strong stand was taken by the courts in favor of freedom of speech. So in Times v. Sullivan, 1964, the Supreme Court for the first time struck down the principle of sovereign immunity, which Britain still has, incidentally, which means you can't attack the sovereign by words. That was a case. And then a little bit later in Brandenburg v. Ohio in 1969, the Supreme Court hit the highest standard that's, I think, ever been reached in protecting freedom of speech. This, incidentally, was a Ku Klux Klan case. It's a hated organization, but it said they had the right to speech. And the criterion that was established was basically that speech should be free up to participation in imminent criminal acts, which means that if you and I go into a store and I have a gun and you plan to rob it and you say, shoot, that's not permitted speech. That's basically the idea. And of course, it's very flexible. None of these principles are precise. They will have to be interpreted. But the general idea is that free speech should be generally quite free, short of participation in criminal acts. Now, that does raise questions. So, for example, suppose that some neo-Nazi organization decides to put up a huge billboard in Times Square in New York, overlooking Times Square, which says, "Kikes to the crematoria." Should that be permitted? I wouldn't object myself if that were taken down, though I think you could give an argument that they should do it. My own feeling is the way to deal with hateful speech is not to silence it, but to expose it. And it can be done. One of the striking examples in the United States is probably beyond any other country that I know in protection of freedom of speech. There was a case, must have been 20 years ago or so, when a neo-Nazi group wanted to have a parade through a town in Illinois, Skokie, Illinois, which is full of Holocaust survivors and so on. They want to have an anti-Semitic demonstration right down the main street. And it was permitted. The ACLU, the Civil Liberties Union, supported it. The town accepted it. Turned out very well. They organized a counter-demonstration to try to expose them. The group was frightened off, never even showed up.
And you think that's a better way to allow it to happen out in the open, as opposed to, say, block it? Like in Europe, Holocaust deniers, it's illegal, but you think that sometimes it's not the best tactical move because it gives them maybe more exposure as opposed to just letting it out there in the open.
But I think sometimes the exposure is good. So take a case that just happened, and where I'm sure you read, Senator Tom Cotton had an op-ed in the New York Times, which aroused the furor, and they finally took it off. And in fact, the editor from the web page, the editor resigned, and so on. Personally, I think it was very good to publish it. It's very good to know that people in high places have the kinds of beliefs that he does, that these are people who are really fundamentally criminals, basic criminals. We should know that. I think it was important when the major newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, published op-eds by John Bolton, former national security advisor, in which he called for bombing Iran right now. So let's be the worst criminal state since the Nazis, because we don't like them. I think it's important to know that the national security advisor is a neo-Nazi. I don't want that to be secret.